to Talking Churchill. I'm Dr. Warren Dockter, and joining me today from the University of Exeter is Professor Richard Toye. Today, we're going to be looking at one of the most interesting and perhaps enigmatic episodes of Churchill's life, and one that, as an American, I've always found particularly strange. And that is the result of the election, the general election, in 1945, where, of course, famously, Winston Churchill was voted out of office, even before the end of the Second World War. Yesterday, July 5th, was in fact the 70th anniversary of polling day of the general election. And the sort of traditional arguments about the Churchill's role in the election of 1945 was that Churchill wasn't particularly interested in social reform or rebuilding the country, and that essentially the Labour Party and Clement Attlee were able to sort of take on these mantras and this mantra of sort of new hope and change for the future. And I wonder, Richard, if you think that's actually a good enough explanation about why Churchill lost the 1945 election.
Well, there's a significant amount of truth in that interpretation, but I think that things are rather more complicated. So it's certainly not true, for example, to say that Churchill wasn't interested in social reform. He had had a long period as a liberal from the Edwardian period through the 1920s and had been involved in and associated with social reform, not only during that period, but to a certain extent as Conservative Chancellor of the Exchequer in the later 1920s as well. And so I think that it's really the case that Churchill was thought during the war that it was important to focus on continuing the war and winning the war rather than talking about the post-war era, and therefore he failed to talk up, if you like, what was his own genuine interest in social reform, and therefore to a certain extent there was a bit of a missed opportunity rather than it being the case that he simply didn't care about these issues.
That's a very good point, and I think it's very important to know that perhaps Churchill stayed focused on his role as a war leader rather than looking at the future, because of course World War II is still going on.
Yes, of course, that's absolutely right. The coalition had broken up in the aftermath of VE Day, and the election had been called. But as you say, the war was still going on, and although it ended in August 1945, in the aftermath of the dropping of the atomic bombs on Japan, at the time the election was fought, it was still widely considered that the war might go on for another 2 years, and therefore Churchill very much played on his credentials as a war leader on a sort of a continuing basis. Now, perhaps the majority of the British people really kind of wanted to believe that the war was over or fundamentally already won, and one could move on to starting to think about post-war issues. But in a sense, although perhaps Churchill's focus was a mistake, we can see that there may have been a sort of an element of rational calculation behind it.
I think that the political dimension of this is very interesting in terms of party politics of Britain. But moving beyond that, to what extent do you think, Richard, this was a personal slight or a personal rejection of Churchill?
Well, it's interesting that Churchill very much really wanted to distance himself from the Conservative Party to a considerable extent during this election. So it's notable that his manifesto doesn't include the word Conservative or Conservative Party, and that he was still fighting his campaign as a sort of as a national candidate, so-called national candidate, national with a capital N. Now, of course, in the 1930s, the national government had been very successful. Essentially, a coalition, but a coalition strongly dominated by the Conservatives. So Churchill may well have thought that trying to sort of use to put himself across on a non-party basis would be very helpful. But of course, ironically, perhaps, he then ended up associating himself with the kind of language and the kind of terminology that had been used by the Conservative Party leaders, Baldwin and Neville Chamberlain, in the 1930s. And so trying to distance himself from the Conservative Party in this way maybe didn't really work, because that national label was itself still very much associated with the Conservatives.
Of course, Churchill's primary interest would be seeing the war through to completion, but he must have been aware of some opinion polls that were going on. I mean, did he have any idea that he was walking into this much of a major defeat in the polls? Did he have any idea that he was going to lose the election?
Well, there certainly was a series of opinion polls which had been begun in 1943 and had consistently showed a strong Labour lead. Churchill, after the election, after his defeat, claimed to have been unaware of this. However, the Conservatives did in fact do a little bit of their own polling, and in Churchill's papers are preserved a document which shows who people wanted as Prime Minister. And 48% of people who were asked wanted Churchill as Prime Minister. The next most popular person was Anthony Eden, and the third was Attlee, who of course ended up as Prime Minister with, I think, 13% of people choosing him. And so Churchill was overwhelmingly the most popular leader still, and to some extent perhaps Labour Party propaganda played on the idea that it was possible to vote Labour and still end up with Churchill as Prime Minister in some new form of coalition. However, in a sense, there were 52% of people who didn't want Churchill as Prime Minister, and equally there was perhaps a degree to which people were not voting on the basis of leadership or who they thought was the best leader. They were actually voting on which party they felt had the most compelling vision of the future. And in spite of the fact that in some ways Attlee was perhaps a rather little known figure or even an uninspiring figure, ultimately he was the leader of the party who did seem to have the most compelling set of policies for this new and undoubtedly very problematic post-war era.
Very interesting as always, Richard. Thank you for joining us, and we hope that this has sort of shed some light on one of the greatest mysteries of British electoral politics in the 20th century. Thank you very much for tuning in, and this has been Talking Churchill.